All right, ready to dive into Wilfrid Sellars?
Let's do it.
We got a stack of readings and notes here. This American philosopher, pretty influential.
Definitely a major figure, yeah.
Seems like a real system builder, grappling with some really big questions.
Oh yeah, some of the most fundamental issues in philosophy, and came up with, some really unique and challenging ideas.
I'm a little intimidated to even start with this. Where do we even begin with Sellars?
Well, one thing that I find fascinating about Sellars is how he tries to reconcile these two ways of seeing the world. Two ways that often seem to clash.
You mean like the world as, explained by science versus the world as we, actually live it?
Exactly. The world as described by science and the world as we experience it in our everyday lives.
So, on one hand, we've got physics and chemistry, atoms, particles, forces. And then on the other hand, it's all about colors and emotions and values, right?
Precisely. Sellars called these two perspectives the scientific image and the manifest image.
Okay, two images. I like that.
So the manifest image, that's our common sense
The
view.
world we live in, right?
Yeah, the world of people and objects and thoughts and
The
feelings.
world we talk about, the world we all you about.
Exactly. It's the world we navigate in our daily life. But then, there's this other image, the scientific image, the world described by physics, chemistry, biology.
And it's incredibly powerful, right? I mean, science is giving us so much, but it can feel so different from how we experience things.
Absolutely. It's a powerful way of explaining the universe, but it can seem kind of, well, foreign in a way.
Like we're almost living in two different worlds.
And a lot of philosophers just kind of throw up their hands at that point. They say, well, either the scientific image is the real one and the manifest image is just an illusion, or vice versa.
But Sellers doesn't do that.
He doesn't. He was much more subtle.
He wants to find a way to, I guess, fit them together somehow.
Right. He recognized that both images capture something important about our experience. His goal was to create what he called a synoptic vision, a way of seeing the world that integrates the best of both.
A grand unified theory of, reality and experience.
Kind of, yeah. He wasn't content to just be reductionist about it. He didn't want to reduce everything to just atoms and particles or to just subjective experiences.
So he was looking for something more, I guess, more nuanced. A view that takes both science and our everyday experience seriously.
Absolutely. And one of the key moves he makes is to focus on the role of language.
Okay, language. Now we're getting into Sellers territory.
Right, because Sellars had this really interesting view of language. He argued that the meaning of a word, it isn't tied to some kind of mysterious essence or, some object out there in the world.
So it's not like the word tree is somehow magically connected to an actual tree.
Exactly. Instead, he said, meaning is determined by the role a word plays in a language. He called it its functional role.
The function of the word.
Right. I'm like, think about how you learn a new word. You don't, suddenly grasp its essence. You learn how to use it
Yeah, you learn how to use it in conversation.
in different contexts.
I guess that's how we build up our understanding of what it means.
Exactly. So for Sellars, it's all about how words are used, how they function within a language, rather than some kind of, you know, direct connection to reality.
Okay, I'm following. But how does this relate back to the two images, the scientific and the manifest?
Well, Sellars thought that both images are shaped by our language, by the concepts we use to understand the world.
Oh, okay, so it's like the way we talk about the world influences how we see it.
Yeah, he argued that there's no such thing as a pure, uninterpreted experience. Even our most basic perceptions, they're already loaded with concepts.
So it's not like we're just passively taking in information from the world. We're actively interpreting it.
Exactly. And he was really critical of what he called the myth of the given.
The myth of the given.
Yeah, this idea that knowledge starts with some kind of pure foundational experiences. Experiences that are just given to us directly.
Like raw data for the senses?
Exactly. But Sellers said no, there are no such givens. Even our sensory experiences, they're already shaped by our conceptual framework, by the way we talk about the world.
Huh, this is making me think about that classic example of seeing a red apple.
Yeah, what about it?
Well, it's not like we just passively see redness, right? We see it as a red apple.
And that already involves a whole bunch of concepts.
Color, shape, object.
Yeah, exactly. Our concepts are always at play, even in what seems like the most basic kind of perception.
So there's no escaping those concepts.
Nope, they're always there. And this has big implications for how we understand the relationship between our minds and the world.
Okay, so no direct access to reality. It's all filtered through our concepts.
Right. And that's just the beginning.
Right, bring on the mind-blowing.
Well, I'm sure you're ready to hear about Sellers' ideas about the mind.
Oh yeah, he had some pretty radical views on that, didn't he?
He did, very much so. For Sellers, things like thoughts, beliefs, desires, those weren't some special kind of spooky, mental entities.
Okay, so like no mind-body dualism.
Definitely not. He saw psychological concepts as more like theoretical concepts in science,
Tools we use to explain things.
tools we use to explain behavior. And he even had this thought experiment.
Oh, I love thought experiments.
He called it the Rileyan myth, where a community basically develops a theory of mind, from scratch just by like observing people's behavior.
Like they're reverse engineering the mind, figuring out how it works, just based on what people do.
Right. And they postulate these inner states to explain it.
That's fascinating. So thoughts and beliefs, these are kind of like constructs.
More like useful ways of talking about how people behave, how they interact with the world.
It all comes back to language and how we use it, doesn't
It
it?
does, and this ties into Sellars' nominalism.
Nominalism, wasn't that something about like being suspicious of abstract concepts?
Exactly. He was very wary of attributing too much reality to abstract concepts.
So no weird ghostly thoughts floating around in some separate meta realm?
Nope. It's just useful ways of making sense of things.
Okay, I'm starting to get a feel for Sellers' overall project here. It's ambitious, to say the least, trying to bring together all these different ways of looking at the world. Science, language, experience.
And it's all connected. For Sellars, he saw a deep unity underlying it all.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's keep diving in.
Sounds good to me. So we've been talking about these two images of the world, the manifest and the scientific.
Right, like two different lenses we use to see reality.
Exactly. And Sellars wasn't content to just let them sit there as, separate, irreconcilable pictures.
Yeah, he wanted to find a way to bring them together somehow.
Right, to create a more complete picture of the world.
So where does science fit into all of this?
Well, for Sellars, science was absolutely essential to understanding the world. He was a strong defender of scientific realism.
Meaning he believed that science actually tells us something true about the way the world is.
Exactly. He thought that if a scientific theory is successful in explaining and predicting phenomena, then we have good reason to believe it's actually describing, reality.
Okay, so no instrumentalism here. He's not saying that scientific theories are just useful tools, but we don't really know if they're true.
No, he was very critical of instrumentalism. For Sellars, the meaning of a scientific term was tied to how it functions within a theory and how that theory connects to the world.
So it's not like there's this sharp divide between observation terms and theoretical terms.
Right. Even our observations are shaped by our theories, by the scientific framework we're using.
Which brings us back to the myth of the given again.
It always comes back to that. There's no such thing as a pure, unmediated access to reality.
Even when we're looking through a microscope.
Even then, think about it. The whole act of observing cells through a microscope is already laden with theoretical assumptions about what cells are and how they work.
Right? We're not just seeing raw data. We're interpreting what we see through the lens of our scientific understanding.
And that lens, that framework, is constantly evolving as science progresses.
Okay, so science gives us a powerful way of understanding the world. But it's not the whole story, right? Sellers still wants to account for the manifest image.
Absolutely. He realized that the scientific image, while incredibly powerful, can't capture everything that's important to us.
Like our moral values, our sense of meaning, our experience of ourselves as persons.
Exactly. Those are all aspects of the manifest image that are central to our lives, and Sellars didn't want to dismiss them as mere illusions.
So it's not about reducing everything to the scientific image, but figuring out how both images can be true in their own way.
And that's where things get really interesting, because it requires us to move beyond some traditional philosophical dualisms.
You mean like the mind-body problem, or the fact-value distinction?
Those are classic examples. Sellars wants us to see the world in a more unified way, to understand how our scientific understanding and our lived experience are interconnected.
It sounds like a pretty radical idea.
It is. It's a challenge to the way we've traditionally thought about things, and it leads us to another fascinating aspect of Sellars' philosophy, his views on norms and values.
Okay, now that's something I've always struggled with. When it comes to naturalism, if everything ultimately comes down to physical facts, how do we account for things like morality?
Right. It's a common objection, but Sellars had a really interesting response. He argued that norms and values have a different kind of existence than physical objects.
What do you mean?
Well, he said they exist within what he called the logical space of reasons.
The logical space of reasons. Okay, now you have to explain that one.
Think of it as the realm of justification, inference, and commitment. It's where we make arguments, offer reasons, and hold each other accountable for our beliefs and actions.
So it's not about reducing moral values to physical facts, but understanding how they function within a different kind of framework.
Exactly. And this framework, this space of reasons, is ultimately grounded in our social practices, in the way we interact with each other and hold each other accountable.
So morality isn't just a matter of personal preference. It's about appealing to shared standards of behavior.
Right. When we make a moral claim, we're not just expressing an opinion, we're participating in a social practice that involves reasons, arguments, and justifications.
It's like we're all playing this elaborate game of morality together with rules and expectations that shape our judgments and actions.
That's a great analogy. And for Sellars, this whole understanding of norms and values was part of his larger project of reconciling the scientific and manifest images. He was showing how we can have a robust, objective morality without having to abandon our scientific understanding of the world.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful idea. So he's saying that science and morality aren't necessarily in conflict?
Not at all. In fact, he thought they could actually work together to give us a more complete picture of what it means to be human.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's like he's offering us a whole new way of thinking about the world.
He is, and it's a way of thinking that I find incredibly challenging but also incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, my brain is definitely working overtime trying to process all of this, but I'm really enjoying the challenge.
Me too. It's not easy, but it's worth the effort.
Okay, so we've talked about science and morality. What else is there?
Well, we can't talk about Sellars without talking about rules. For him, rules were absolutely fundamental to understanding what it means to be human.
Okay, rules. Let's talk about rules. All right, rules. Hit me with some Sellarsian wisdom on rules.
Well, for Sellars, being human wasn't just like about biology, genes and neurons and stuff.
It was more than that.
Much more. He saw humans as, well, he famously said humans are creatures of rules, not just habits.
Creatures of rules, not habits. I like that.
Right.
It's got that Kantian vibe, like there's this intentionality, this rationality that sets us apart.
Exactly. And Sellars was definitely influenced by Kant. He saw this ability to follow rules as essential to what makes us human.
To our capacity for language, thought, all that good stuff.
All of it. He believed there was this deep connection between the rules that govern our language and the rules that govern our behavior.
So, like, the same principles are at work in both how we speak and how we act. That there's this underlying structure.
Yeah, precisely. He was fascinated by how rules shape our understanding of the world, our place in it.
And did he distinguish between different types of rules?
He did. He talked about ought-to-dos and ought-to-be's.
Ought-to-dos, ought-to-be's. Okay, now you got to break that down for me.
Sure. So think of ought-to-dos as specific instructions for acting in a given situation.
Okay, practical guidelines.
Right. Like, if you want to make tea, you ought to boil water.
If you want to cross the street, you ought to look both ways.
Exactly. They're kind of like, recipes for action.
Algorithms.
Yeah. And then you have ought-to-be's, which are more like general principles, values.
Okay, so less about specific actions and more about, like, how we should be in the world.
Exactly. Things like, you ought to be honest.
You ought to be kind. You ought to be brave.
Precisely. Those aren't tied to specific actions, but to broader ideals about how we should live.
And I'm guessing he thought these ought-to-be's, they're like the foundation for the ought-to-dos?
Exactly. He argued that we reason from general principles to specific actions.
So we start with an ought-to-be, like, I ought to be helpful. And then we figure out the ought-to-dos that flow from that.
Right. Like, okay, if I ought to be helpful, then I ought to help my neighbor with their groceries.
It makes our actions, like, meaningful, intelligible.
Right. It's not just a random collection of behaviors. It's a coherent expression of our values and commitments.
It all goes back to those ought-to-be's.
It does. And, we talked about intentions before.
Yeah.
Sellars saw intentions as this kind of bridge between ought-to-be's and ought-to-dos.
Okay, how so?
Well, intentions, they're mental states, but they have, motivational force.
They're not just like passive thoughts, they're commitments?
Exactly. They're commitments to act in certain ways, guided by our beliefs and values.
So the ought-to-be leads to the intention, which leads to the ought-to-do.
You got it. And for Sellars, this whole process, this reasoning from principles to actions, that's what makes us human.
It's what separates us from the rule followers of the animal kingdom.
Right. We're not just responding to stimuli. We're acting on reasons.
Okay, this is pretty amazing stuff, but, I have to admit, my brain's starting to feel a little full. There's just, like, so much to unpack here with Sellars.
He was a very systematic thinker. He built this whole philosophical system,
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface, but, I mean, where do we even go from here? What are we supposed to, do with all these Sellarsian insights?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is that Sellars is urging us to think differently, to move beyond those simplistic ways of carving up the world.
Like those old dualisms.
Yeah, mind versus body, facts versus values, that kind of thing.
He wants us to see the connections.
He does. He wants us to see how everything is, ultimately interconnected. Science, morality, language, experience, it's all part of this rich tapestry of being human.
It's a holistic vision.
It is, and it's a vision that I think has a lot to offer us, even if, we don't agree with everything Sellers said.
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely a challenging thinker.
Oh yeah, but he was also deeply committed to making philosophy matter, to connecting it to our lives.
To helping us live better lives, maybe.
I think so. I think he believed that philosophy could help us understand ourselves better, understand the world better, and ultimately, live more meaningful lives.
Well, on that note, I think it's safe to say that our deep dive into Sellers has given us a lot to chew
A
on.
lot to ponder, a lot to wrestle with.
And I have a feeling we'll be, revisiting these ideas for a long time to come.
Me too. He was a philosopher who stayed with you long after you finished reading him.
So, to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this Sellarsian adventure. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning. And remember Sellers' advice. Always strive for that stereoscopic vision.
That's the key.